competition. It's not a sport. It's just a TV show. Okay, fine. If you want it to just be a TV show, great. But as a TV show, it's a piss-poor fucking TV show, man. I mean, there's no internal logic to it. There's no, rules of the universe. And I'm not talking about, foot on the road. I'm not talking about, specific rules in wrestling. But there's no rules to the universe to govern what the audience should and should not expect, and to control the audience's reaction to what you're putting out there. And it's and that's why it doesn't work. That's why it worked back in the days. And things like unscripted promos and calling it in the ring and not overly choreographed matches, I mean, those were all facets of what made professional wrestling more exciting in the 80s. And even up to the Attitude Era. The Attitude Era, to me, is like the one time where Vince McMahon was like, okay, I'll let my wrestling show be wrestling. And up till then and since then, he's wanted it to be anything else. He's wanted it to be anything else but a wrestling show. But in the Attitude Era, it was like, oh, this is like wrestling. This is great. And wrestling works. Poetry works if you follow the guidelines and you do things logically. And it's wrestling works like pop music works. If there's form and there's structure. Those are the things that make wrestling work. And the audience in their mind has to know, when you're listening to a song and you think you know the thing that's going to come next, whether it's a key change or, oh, here comes the chorus or whatever, when that happens, you feel good. You're psychologically rewarded for being able to anticipate what's going to happen, and when that thing happens, you feel good. Wrestling is the same way, or it needs to be the same way. There needs to be structure that the audience can follow for when the product follows that structure, it's rewarding. And those are broad strokes about what I feel about modern wrestling.
But you're on the money there, and that this has been a phenomenon that's been going on with WWE specifically since the very early 2000s, when they decided to move forward with the idea of scripted promos, and now there's an agent for every match, and they pretty much plan everything out before they ever step through the curtain. Which, when you do that, one of the biggest things about wrestling, throughout the ages, especially through the 90s as well, was there was a level of unpredictability where you were never completely sure what was going to happen next because you had such unique, interesting, and at times volatile characters that were involved. That's the thing about what you're saying in regards to having things be logical and to have continuity and to, work within a certain structure, a creative structure where, people are going to be able to follow what exactly is happening to fully enjoy what's happening, so that when you do on occasion divert from that formula, it has much more of an effect. But when you're constantly just, nothing makes sense, nothing is logical, traditional storytelling is thrown out the window, there's not defined, good guy, bad guy, heel, babyface, it becomes increasingly difficult for the average wrestling fan or the mainstream fan. I won't even say wrestling fan. It becomes increasingly difficult for the mainstream fan or potential mainstream fan to want to get invested in this. Because you're absolutely right, Heath, is that if I was not into wrestling and I turned on Monday Night Raw, for example, and I was like, you know what, I've heard a lot about this wrestling, I'm interested, let me sit down and watch this. And then I'm going to sit and watch this long, overly convoluted, nonsensical program. I'm probably, number one, not going to make it through the full 3 hours, and then number two, I'm going to probably very quickly change the channel. Because
but David, here's the thing. Okay, let's say you did sit down and watch all 3 hours, and you're like, wow, this is kind of a mess. But for some reason, you decided, hey, I'm going to give it a chance next week. That whole 3 hours that you spent watching that show the week before is all out the fucking window next week. None of it mattered, and that's why the wrestling audience, I think, in general, is shrinking because the wrestling is generating so much content right now. Professional wrestling as a whole, with AEW, WWE, all its various brands, all the indies, all the other major minors, if you want to call them, NWA, ROH, Impact, or whatever the fuck they're calling themselves this week.
Sure.
And you're asking people to invest their time, and you don't give them anything. I mean, I'll turn on Raw. Well, I haven't turned on Raw since the quarantine because it's ridiculous. You have to have people there. I mean, I know, as all wrestling fans know, at the heart of it, it's a couple of guys pretending to fight. And that is just so more painfully obvious when there's no crowd interaction, when there's no audience there and as annoying as modern wrestling audiences can be, because they're all just in it for themselves, what's the next thing I can chant? There's not a lot of genuine reaction anymore. It's just everybody's waiting for their next opportunity to chant, and what are they going to chant? Without even that amount of interaction, it's just like the curtain is just thrown back, and you see it for what it really is, and it's fucking painful, man.
It can be, man. It can be. I mean, that's a huge debate within all wrestling circles. I mean, obviously, for any of us that are involved in wrestling on an independent level, we don't even have that option of being able to run, empty arena shows. It's just not something that's a possibility. But aside from that, from just myself, I'll just use myself as an example. There's such a huge part of what I do that involves the audience, and that I personally can't stand the fans. But there's such a huge part of what happens when I come through that curtain with whichever one of my clients I'm coming through with, where the crowd is such a huge part of that experience, and that, I myself, including all the other individuals involved, a big part of the reason why folks come out to independent wrestling shows specifically is to get that unique one-on-one interaction that you simply don't get by watching it on TV. And I dare say a lot of times you don't even get when you go pay for an overpriced ticket to one of the big leagues to go to one of their events as well. So they come to independent wrestling for that one-on-one interpersonal experience. And if that includes me talking them into the ground because they're nothing but filthy, dirty trailer park trash, just disgusting insectoids that, if they touch me, I'm going to have to go see a medical physician. Anything along those lines. If that brings joy to their ridiculously inane, underprivileged, moronic hearts, then by all means, I'm willing to give them that. But and I derive a little bit of joy from that, because quite frankly, if they're stupid enough to talk with me and to try to be disrespectful to me, it's my, absolute delight to just completely grind them into the ground with the heel of my high-fashion shoe or boot, whatever I particularly am wearing at that point in time. But, but I understand what you're saying, Heath, and that the empty arena stuff is getting harder and harder to watch, and we're seeing a trend that the audience is shrinking.
David, the phenomenon that you are describing, it's called heat.
Yes, that is true.
And guess what? Got no crowd, You got no fucking heat, man.
Yeah.
And heat is something that's been true heat. I'll tell you the last time I saw somebody fucking get some real fucking heat at a wrestling show. I've got some buddies who work backstage for WWE, and whenever Raw comes to town, it's usually Raw, not usually SmackDown. Raw comes to town, we get seats. They're usually by the hard cam. Everybody gets an allotment of some comp tickets or whatever.
Sure.
I went to a Raw, I almost said taping, not a Raw broadcast. This was probably 4 years ago, and say what you want about Stephanie McMahon, but she came out to talk to the crowd that night, and she got more fucking heat than anybody else on that show, anybody else on that card, any other personality involved with it. She came out, and it's just like, wow, people really fucking hate you. But that's why you're there. That's why you're there, man. And and if you don't have that, if you don't have what you were speaking more of the one-on-one interaction, and that is definitely a facet of indie wrestling that is individual to it. But just the heat, man. It's part and parcel of why we fell in love with it as kids. It's why we will go back and watch the same angles and matches over and over again on the network and on YouTube. It's because of that, and that's palpable, and that is real. That is real. Say what you want to about, it's fake and blah, 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 whatever, wrestling's fake. That shit is real. Fucking heat is real. And if you don't have a crowd, you don't have heat. And if you don't have heat, then what's the fucking point?
Well, and that's you're right. I mean, that's a huge part of the storytelling device that's included with, I want not just wrestling. I'll just say, even movies, TV shows. There's always going to be that certain part of the story where the heel is going to have the advantage. And the babyface is going to have to somehow figure out a way to overcome. But you're right, man. Without a crowd, it's very difficult to try to draw any kind of heat. But speaking about heat, my early wrestling memories involved, because you were mentioning earlier about recording stuff off from MTV with a tape recorder. I mean, I used to do the same thing, man. I mean, where I live, we didn't have MTV. There was like a little half-hour music video show, a syndicated show that come on in the afternoon that I would record. But I'd record songs. I would record audio from TV shows. I recorded myself reading the various wrestling magazines, the aftermags. Pretending I was Howard Finkel or Mean Gene or anybody along those lines, and I really feel like that developed my voice that I would later use in radio and podcasting, and now for what I do, as the fearless leader of Darkness Worldwide, David Barnabas Spector. But my early days of wrestling were the Von Erichs and the Freebirds from World Class. And early Roddy Piper. I remember distinctly the first Piper's Pit. But speaking about heat, as soon as you said heat, this is what's ingrained in my mind, Heath, is before WrestleMania 2, when Piper and Mr. T were getting ready to have the boxing match, on Piper's Pit, they had the little mini wrestler, the Haiti Kid. And he said that he loved Mr. T. Mr. T was his friend. So Bob Orton's holding him, and Mr. T shaving his head in the mohawk like Mr. T. And I just remember watching that as a kid going, oh, that's terrible. That's the worst thing I've ever seen. I can't wait to see Roddy Piper get his butt whipped. And I will always remember that. And, it was around that time that the crowd started to go the way of Roddy. And even myself, especially going into WrestleMania 3, I was a huge Roddy Piper fan. But it's amazing how those are the things that you remember. Things that touch a nerve, that touch an emotion, Those are the things that you latch onto and that you remember so fondly.